Welcome to Bharat Media and welcome to our show Rubaru. I heartily welcome all of our viewers and listeners today to this show Rubaru, where we introduce you to some really amazing and inspiring personalities with the hope that all of us can walk away feeling energized and inspired by their life journeys as well as their accomplishments. So today I have a very, very special guest for you. And the reason I'm saying that he is very, very special is because it's not every day that I welcome a rocket scientist to our studio. So I am going to heartily welcome a rocket scientist slash author to our studios today. And he is not only a rocket scientist and an author, he's a very, very entertaining storyteller. His debut novel, The Swaraj Spy, is now out. And I would highly recommend everybody to go out there, pick up a copy, and read it. So without further ado, let's welcome the author of The Swaraj Spy, Vijay Balan. Vijay, welcome to the show.
Thank you, Dee, and welcome to all of the viewers and listeners. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening to you, depending on where you are on this wonderful world of ours. And I am delighted to be here, and thank you for the opportunity.
Oh, of course, the pleasure and honor is all ours. All right, so I'm very excited to talk about your debut novel, The Swaraj Spy. But before we dive into that, I want our viewers to get to know you a little bit. We haven't heard much about you. You are a first-time author, so I want to introduce you to our viewers. So tell us a little bit about your childhood and about your growing up years.
Okay, I was born and brought up in Uti, which is a hill station in southern India, for those of you who may not have heard of it. And it was just such a wonderful place to grow up. It was really like living inside a picture postcard, if I can use that term. And that probably kind of informs my visual writing, because I grew up in a very beautiful place. So I went to school there, and I had two broad sets of interests. I had interests in physics and math, which is what kind of took me down the aerospace path. But the other interest that I had was in history and in writing. And so, after my career in engineering and in management, I've I was fortunate enough to tap into that passion that I always had for history and writing, and that resulted in this first work. And that interest in history was really instilled, if you will, by my school principal and teacher. He was a Canadian man. His name was Donald Fox. And he had lived in India. In fact, he had gone to our school earlier, and he was then a faculty member of a teacher in the school. And imagine kind of a very portly man with a big red beard teaching history, and he would teach it in such an engaging manner. He would act out things, and he was a great lover of India. So, for instance, he would talk to us about Shivaji and Aurangzeb, and this big portly man would walk this way, and he says, well, Aurangzeb would be looking this way, and Shivaji would be and sting him, and he would turn around. We were all in fifth standard, and he got us roaring with laughter. And
made it come alive.
He made it come alive, and from then on, I've been hooked with him. Yes.
It's very interesting you say that, because I feel like your writing is like that. I saw the pictures come alive when I read. So it's just, so many scenes, there are scenes of Uti, there are scenes of, the women sticking together like mannequins. And I could see all of that happen in front of my eyes. So obviously, shout out to the amazing teachers out there who instilled this amazing love of history in you, but also this amazing skill that you have.
Thank you. Thank you indeed. Yeah. So, what I've done is the book is based on researched facts. I researched all of this over 6.5 years.
Mm-hmm.
It is not a history book. It's not a book on political science. It is really a human story. And what I've done is I've used my narrative skills.
Mm-hmm.
I've used the story as a vehicle
Mm-hmm.
a fairly complex and cluttered piece of history.
Mm. Yeah, and it is interesting, and we'll talk a little bit more about that in a little bit. I want to have you hold your thought there because I want to learn a little bit more about you. So tell me how that, and I heard you say that you're a perfect combo of, in my mind now, left brain, right brain, history buff, rocket scientist, aerospace engineer. How does that transition though happen from a very busy career in aerospace and management, like you said, into the life of an author? How does that transition take place? How did it happen in your life?
Okay, so the aerospace part, I'll just kind of go back to my boyhood again.
Uh-huh.
Actually, kind of a strange teenager. I used to go to the library and cut out pictures, and not the kind of pictures that teenage boys usually cut out. I would cut out pictures of astronauts. So
Oh, wow.
I had a dream to, my dream was to be part of the U.S. space program, and I'm fortunate after I finished graduate school here in the U.S. to work on the propulsion control system for the space shuttle. And then I did that for a few years, and then went a different in a different direction. I got an MBA and then moved into management in what people today call fintech,
Uh-huh.
financial transaction processing. So anyway, while all of this was going on, and you're quite right. I mean, I had a very busy career, which was quite engaging, but this story was always in the back of my mind, and we will get to how that came about in just a minute.
Uh-huh.
So it's been percolating in the back of my mind, and then at one point I was running a consulting company, so I had time in between client engagements.
Uh-huh.
So
Uh-huh.
what I would do is I would, go hell for leather on a client engagement, and then when I had downtime, I would come up and start writing this book. So I wrote in spurts, and it was interesting because each time I did that, there was a ramp time
Uh-huh.
got to that zone. And those of you who are writers will know exactly what I mean. You got to get to that sweet spot before words start flowing. So
Correct.
kind of there are some writers who are very disciplined and who start writing at 6 in the morning and write for a few hours. Mine was not disciplined. Mine was very disjointed, and I wrote when I had the time. And and then I was also doing the research work in the middle of it all, which is what the kind of
Right.
that it did. And
Right.
in the end, it ended up in this product.
Wow. And we will talk about the research. I do want to talk about your process a little bit more because it's a very, it's historical fiction and that, needs a lot of heavy research. So I will ask you a little bit about that in just a little bit. But I want the viewers and listeners to get into the story. So tell us a little bit about the narrative of the story. What is it about, and what is the message that you as an author are trying to convey?
Okay, so I imagine most of your viewers and listeners are Indian or people with an interest in India. And so my guess is most people know what the Indian National Army or the INA is. But for those, I will just give you a brief kind of historical setup.
Sure.
So in World War II, the popular narrative is that the good guys were the British, the Americans, and the Soviets, and the bad guys were the Germans, the Italians, and the Japanese. And this was a war that consumed the whole world. But from the point of view of the colonized people, and India was a British colony at that time, the British weren't necessarily benevolent. I mean, they were oppressors. So there was a freedom movement that was going on in India, which most people have heard of with Gandhiji and peaceful non-cooperation and so on. But there was another movement which took a very different approach. And this was the Indian National Army. And the idea was as simple as it was audacious. The idea was, let's get the British soldiers who are fighting for I mean, the Indian soldiers that are fighting for Britain, and there were 2 million of them. 2 million Indian soldiers fought for Britain, which is not widely known. And the idea was if you could get even a small subset of those soldiers to switch sides, it could knock Britain out of the war and India could gain independence. So the Japanese intelligence was interested in that. Obviously, they wanted to knock Britain out of the war. And this group called the Indian National Army and the Indian Independence League, they had an interest because it would gain independence. So that is kind of the historical backdrop of the book. But let me ask. I won't ask you, Dee, because you have read the book. But I will also ask your audience to name the first leader of the INA. And my guess is 99.99% of the people would say Netaji Subhash Chandra Bose.
Correct.
And they would be wrong, because the first leader of the INA was a man called Captain Mohan Singh. And the reason I mention this is there was an INA before the one that most people know about. And that one collapsed because of tensions between the Japanese and the Indians. So that's the historical backdrop. But as I said, the book is not a history book or a political science book. It's a book about a man and his wife. So this man, his name was T.P. Kumaran Nair, was my granduncle, my dad's mother's brother. And he was an officer of the British paramilitary outfit called the Malabar Special Police. The story begins when he was asked to disperse a group of protesters agitating for Indian independence. Beach in what was then Madras, today Chennai. But as he got close to the demonstrators, he found out that they were all women, so he refused to follow the order. So the British kicked him out of the MSP. He went back to Malabar, tried his hands at business. It was going well. Then the Great Depression hit the whole world.
Right.
His business. And he was kind of at a loose end because he was used to a life of action. He was married and he was trying to kind of find meaning in his life. And then he moved to Singapore to help his brother-in-law to kind of, for a better life, to earn some money and bring his new life over. World War II intervened and the Japanese very quickly came down the Malayan Peninsula and captured Singapore. So now he's stuck behind enemy lines.
Right.
And in Singapore, he had met a group of people who then went on to form what was called the Indian Independence League and the INA. They convinced him, because of his paramilitary background, to join a spy school in a place called Penang. And he was actually trained as a spy by the Japanese. So when 20 cadets from the school were sent to India, Japanese, without the knowledge of their Indian counterparts, and possibly got captured, my granduncle was sent on a rescue mission. But with very different instructions. The Japanese told him to go find the surviving cadets and go to the mission, which was to spy on British air bases and naval bases and so on. The Indian leadership of the IAL told him, because of this tension that was there between the Japanese and Indians, and the ability of a double agent, they told him to go to India, identify the surviving agents, and hide till the end of the war. So the book is about his journey. The book is all about his journey from Malabar to Singapore, but also his journey from Malaya, Penang, through the jungles of kind of through a hall of mirrors, because he didn't know whom he could trust.
Right.
And then back to India and all the twists and turns that go with this story. It is about how his wife dealt with her husband being somewhere behind enemy lines, maybe dead, maybe alive. And she deals with it in her very kind of a unique way. So this is a very human story based on research facts, set within the backdrop of some very complicated, cluttered history.
Yeah, what a beautifully explained narrative. Thank you for doing that. Obviously, there are lots of twists and turns in there. But the amazing part to me is that, you know how they say truth is stranger than fiction? And, the way you were telling me that this is really your granduncle's story, it's just amazing where he started and where his life took him. Not really planned per se, but what an amazing story, and what an amazing family history to have in order to be able to then put it out and share it with the rest of the world.
Yeah, and as I said, I was fortunate in having it come out in this book. It's called The Swaraj Spy. It is published by HarperCollins in India. And indeed, I mean, it's not often that one gets the opportunity to kind of pull so many different strands of both personal life as well as the history of an entire people together and kind of weave it together as a story.
Yeah. Did you have a hard time trying to figure out where fact ended and fiction began, or weaving or marrying the two together somehow? Was that hard?
It wasn't a hard task to do that per se. Having said that, writing is always a question of balance, right? You've got to figure out the right balance based on the audience that you're writing for. And I wrote the book not for a scholar or even a history buff. I wrote the book for anybody that likes good writing. So
Nice.
I used that fictional vehicle kind of deliberately to weave in some of these facts, right? So that part wasn't hard. But what was difficult was the research, because this was an 80-plus-year-old story and the trail had gotten cold.
Sure. Yeah.
When I was growing up, my dad would tell me bits and stories. My late dad used to tell me bits and pieces of the story, and they were rattling around my head. And so then one day I had an epiphany that, man, this is a story that needs to be told. And I said, okay, fine, great. Let me go to the web and find out. And there was nothing, absolutely nothing. The trail was not only frozen, there was permafrost on it.
Yeah.
So I started with family and got a lot of info from family. But then there's also the challenge of separating the mythology, because someone like this, there's a tendency to kind of deify and mythologize.
Correct.
So I double check facts from multiple sources to sort that out. And then I made multiple trips from here in the US where I live to India and other parts of the world to actually see these places, because I'm a very visual writer. I like to take you as a reader and put you there. And meet people. One person introduced me to another, and then get my hands on documents. Because one thing about the British, they wrote a lot of stuff down, except for the things that they didn't want you to know. That they didn't know. So that was the part that took quite a bit of work. And I'll give you another perspective as well. A good part of this book is set in Singapore and in India and in Burma. And I've been to Singapore many times, but going to today's Singapore doesn't have, because it's all steel and glass.
Correct.
So I must have spent, by the time you add up all the hours, Deepika, I must have spent maybe a couple of months on YouTube looking at videos of wartime Singapore.
Right.
Look like what does an air raid sound like?
Correct. Yeah.
It was part of the research. And Burma was a little too dangerous to travel to, especially to the parts of Burma on the border with Mizoram, India, where the states. So what I did was I used Google Earth, and because Burma hadn't changed as much, I was able to zoom down to these places where this man had gone to get a visual reference. So those were the parts that were challenging. But once I had all of that put together, kind of weaving it in, I just followed my instincts to take me and guide me where the story would go.
Right. It's amazing how, and with your very first book, to tackle a challenge of this size, again, with historical fiction, it's so important to get the facts right. And then, like you said, to be able to learn the milieu that it was set in. It's amazing. Kudos to you for doing such a fantastic job and succeeding in what you attempted to do.
Well,
That is
because
fantastic.
because it's my first book, I didn't know any different, so I wanted to do something fairly difficult.
Good point. Good point. Tell us a little bit, Vijay, about the title of the book itself. How did that come about? And we know a little bit about, your granduncle, where he started, and how he, again, started in his mind, how he went from being a worker bee of the British to working against them. Tell us a little bit about how the title came about in your head.
Okay, great. That's a great question. Uh, Most of you probably know that the word Swaraj means self-rule.
Mm-hmm.
And Swaraj was a slogan during the Indian independence movement. The great Bal Gangadhar Tilak, he said that Swaraj is my birthright and I shall have it. So that's one thread.
Mm-hmm.
Another thread is that the spy school that I talked to you about in Penang
Mm-hmm.
was called the Indian Swaraj Institute. So
Mm-hmm.
that is the other source of the word Swaraj.
Mm-hmm.
Third is this, and you touched on this. This book is really also about personal transformation because when he began, he spent that beach in Gras,
Mm-hmm.
a very grateful officer. He was the kind of person, if you told him, well, go take that hill, he would take that hill and 3 hills behind it. Right? As the story evolves, as you will find when you read it, he becomes more reflective and really kind of questions a lot of what was going on. Because this whole notion of who were really the good guys and who were the bad guys in this whole conflict is very nuanced.
Yeah.
The British, the good guys, because that's the popular narrative all around the world. Not
Right.
officers. What about the Japanese? Well, maybe they had their own agenda. For example, I'll go back to the tension between the Japanese and the Indians. The Indians asked the Japanese to sign a written declaration that the Japanese had no designs on colonial designs of India. The Japanese signed the agreement, not under the first INA, not under the second INA. So he was going through a lot of personal transformation. So then I won't obviously reveal a lot about the book, but he finds his own self-rule of a very different kind as the book evolves. So that is the third source of the Swaraj. So there are three. One is the overall independence movement. The second is the name of the spy school, and the third is the protagonist's own journey towards a self-rule of a very internal kind.
Oh, that's beautiful. Thank you for explaining to us. It captures way more than my initial understanding of what that title meant. So thank you for explaining that to me. I'm going back to my literature classes in high school where they talk about author's purpose, and I'm hearing you say that, and I'm internalizing that message. So thank you for sharing that. Vijay, I want to take a little bit of a break from all these questions, and I would love to invite you to do a short reading from the book for us. And the reason I'm saying that is because then I will want to talk a little bit about your writing also and how visual and descriptive it is. But before that, let's take a break, and if you can read a short excerpt from your book for our viewers and listeners, that would be amazing.
Okay, I'd be delighted to do that. So let me set this up for you.
Okay.
This is when the protagonist of the book, Kumar, my granduncle, is evacuating his sister, her name is Tangam, and her two children, helping them evacuate Singapore right in the middle of a Japanese air raid. And they're accompanied by Tangam's husband, who goes by the name AM, his initials, and another brother. Okay? So here goes. On the day of the departure, Tangam, Sulu, and Suku, the two children, climbed into an RAF truck. Kumar drove while AM and Gopal sat in the back with two small suitcases. As they neared the harbor, Cars and vans jostled horse carts and rickshaws laden with people carrying large bundles. Drivers leaned heavily on their horns as if the sound could part the traffic. A huge throng pushed and elbowed its way from a sea of abandoned vehicles to the docks. The Keppel docks in Singapore, a source of British pride, had controlled the commerce between the Far East and the Indian Ocean. But the round the clock bombing had reduced hubris to rubble. Roofless warehouses now gaped at the sky. The dockside crane lay sprawled on its side, its legs twisted in grotesque angles like a giant squashed insect. The funnels of a sunken steamer rose out of the water like pillars, supporting dark clouds of smoldering ash that asphyxiated everyone's lungs. Kumar, AM, and Gopal linked arms to form a protective ring around Tangam and the children. They shuffled slowly as the crowd carried them forward. It took all their strength to keep the shield intact. Yells and cries in many languages tore through the air. Sulu gripped a suitcase with one hand and wrapped her other arm tightly around her mother. Tangam tightly held the precious boarding permits and the second suitcase in one hand and clutched onto Suku with the other. They tried hard to keep their balance. The Malay threw the little band about like driftwood washed ashore. They reached a gate beyond which armed soldiers allowed only passengers to pass. Policemen desperately tried to control the crowd. Kumar steered the group to Royal Navy officers checking boarding permits. A swarm of hands waving pieces of paper besieged the four harried officers. Checking permits against identification was impossible. The officers looked quickly at permits and yelled instructions to the gate sentries about the number of passengers. 2, 4, 3. AM let go Kumar's hand to get the papers from Tangam. He thrust the sweat-soaked permits at a sub-lieutenant. A torn epaulet bearing his rank insignia dangled from his shoulder. The officer looked absently at the permit, jerked his head at a guard, and yelled, 3. AM stuffed the papers back in Tangam's hand as she moved forward with the children. The soldier glanced at the papers and grunted, Ship 4, there. He pointed at a ship anchored 100 yards away. The ship's name had been hastily painted over in black. There was no time for goodbyes. Tangam met AM's gaze and smiled for a brief second. The crowd swallowed her and the children as it surged towards the ship like a tidal wave of heads. Kumar, AM, and Gopal tried to see the travelers board the ship, but the police quickly shooed them away. The crowd pulled in different directions towards two ships. Tangam kept her eye on her ship's funnel and dragged the children with all her strength towards the vessel. A carefully pulled tight bun came loose and wavy hair twisted crazily about her shoulders. Sulu used the suitcase in her hand as an instrument to push people away. She ignored hurled curses and helped her mother as much as she could. They were halfway to the ship when the air raid sirens went off. The crowd surged forward as one mass, jammed together with no room to take cover. Bombers appeared over the harbor in two giant Vs. Anti-aircraft guns let out deafening bangs. A shudder ran through the crowd at first as frightened screams ran from all directions. After the first few shells, they ignored the guns and pushed relentlessly towards the ships. The bombs fell like hail. Tangam prayed that their ship would not be struck. Oil storage tanks at one end of the harbor exploded into flames. A few bombs fell on warehouses, but they spared steamer number 4 and its dock. The stench of burning petrol descended like a toxic cloud. Sulu coughed and tried to raise her free arm to protect her face. The crush pinned the arm to her side like epoxy. She thought she saw the word city off, faintly visible under the black paint smeared over the ship's name. Tangam willed herself to push through to the gangway that was only yards away. It's close now. Stay close to me. Come on. A little Chinese girl just a few feet from Tangam suddenly lost her grip on her mother's hand. She quickly disappeared into the crowd. The panic-stricken mother screamed for help. Tangam caught the woman's haunted eyes. There was nothing she could do to help. The horde carried Tangam and the children away from the unfortunate woman. She thrust her boarding papers at an officer at the foot of the gangway. He waved her on without looking at the permits.
Wow. Wow. I have to do a little applause over here. The scene is so beautiful. And even, when I was reading it and as I'm hearing you read it, I'm imagining the entire scene, the wave of, this entire sea of people, jostling and pushing, and people thrusting their boarding passes at the officers, and the bombing, and the little Chinese kid getting lost, getting separated from the mother. It's just it's beautiful. And it's not just this scene itself. There are so many scenes that we can talk about. They're so visual, they're so descriptive. And you told us a little bit about how that came about from your childhood. Tell us a little bit more about how does that happen. It's not every day that I read such beautiful language and such beautiful writing. So tell us a little bit about when you are writing. And you also said before that you wrote it in a very disjointed way, in between your projects and your work. I can imagine that, because this seems like it's the work of somebody who is doing this for 18 hours a day, sitting at a table and pouring everything they have into their writing. Tell us a little bit about how is your writing so visual and so evocative of the scenes that you are trying to describe.
Well, thank you for those kind words. Well, and a part of it is just my nature. I tend to be an observer. I love beauty. I love art. So, wherever I go, and I've had a good fortune to travel to a fair part of the globe. So wherever I go, I kind of, take in scenes, absorb sounds. And so in my mind, I've kind of got a video library kind of sitting somewhere there. And I kind of, tap into that at times. I also observe body language, tones in which people speak. A lot of my career took me to parts of the world where I did not speak the language and people did not speak English. So being able to notice nuances in body language and so on is something that's kind of been a part of my development. So I guess a lot of that was in my mind. But having said that, what I try to do is to take you as a reader and put you there. So you experience, see, hear, smell everything that my characters are going through, right? Because then the history and all of that kind of just comes in automatically. In fact, a reader called me and told me that it is only after she put the book away she realized she had actually learned a lot of history. So that was because that was the objective, right? So, but having said that, it's a balance, right? So, if and for aspiring writers there, I will just share this. If you make the book all about description, and if you have pages and pages of description, then you lose the reader, right?
Yeah.
So you just need enough. But the book needs to be plot-driven because you need to move the story forward and bring the reader along with you. And it was just something that I experimented with, and it just evolved. After I wrote the first draft of the book, I went back with that kind of distance of detachment, and I went back and edited the book a few times. I also shared the manuscript with people whose opinions I respect, including one person who told me to cut out 1/3 of the book.
Good advice.
When you kind of sweated over every word, that was hard to do. But she was right. She was absolutely right because the book was too long. So part of it is innate.
Yeah.
Part of it is also giving it to others that you trust and have them reflect back to you. The third part is to receive those comments and put your ego aside. That's very important.
True.
Because when people say bad things about your children, I mean it's a little hard to take, but you have to put your ego aside and say, does that make sense or doesn't it make sense? And I accepted many of the comments, and some of them I didn't. So it's combination of those kinds of things that is kind of it has resulted in the kind of work that is there in this book.
Yeah, yep. And I do have to say that the person who gave you the advice to cut 30%, I think that was really great advice too, because that has shown in the pace of the book. It is so pacey, and it's, to me, like you said, that feedback that you got, that they didn't realize that they actually learned about history. I would agree with that, because the story moves so fast, but then in the background, there's so much history happening that you automatically just imbibe it without realizing what's happening.
Exactly right, because a lot of people will get a book and it will sit on their nightstand and they will read a little bit and then it stays on the nightstand. And so what I try to do, and with the advice I got from people, it helped me get there, was to keep the people reading the book. And the purpose of every chapter is only one purpose, and that is to get them to read the next chapter.
Perfect.
Right? So I kept refining it. But there's a point at which you've got to stop refining it, because I think there's a saying, it's wrongly attributed to Da Vinci. It was the French scholar writer Paul Valéry who said, works are never finished, they are merely abandoned. So at some point you got to say, all right, enough, and let the world have it, and take it from there.
Yeah. I think you abandoned it at the exact leave. Okay, Vijay, let's talk a little bit about, and we've been talking about how you inadvertently learned the history. So let's talk a little bit about, the background is the Second World War, the time, what happened with the Indian National Army, what was happening in India, the moving to Singapore, through Burma and Malaya. So all of these things that we are talking about. So the young generation, today's generation out there, they are easily a generation or two generations removed now from those events. How contextual would you say is this story, and especially carved into the history that it is? How contextual is it to today's youth?
That's actually a brilliant question, and it is so relevant, particularly for India, where a good percentage of its population is under the age of 30. So this happened a long time ago, right? And it is important for them to understand how they got the freedom to be citizens of a free country, but that was, again, it's all lost in history. True. But as Mark Twain said, history doesn't repeat itself. Doesn't always repeat itself, but it often rhymes.
Right.
So knowing what happened to their grandparents, time of the British, helps put their lives today in some context, because there are parallels between those times and how great powers the world today. You see the action of, back in those days, the great powers were Japan and Great Britain and the United States. Today, you've got the Chinese and you've got the Americans, and this whole notion of great powers kind of dealing with things based on their own national interest has not stopped. In fact, there's an African proverb which says, when elephants fight, the grass gets trampled.
Yeah.
So for those reasons, it's important. But coming to your question, I think school systems all over the world, it's not just India, but everywhere, have done a disservice in the way they teach history. They've made it boring.
Yeah.
It's all about rote memorization and repetition.
Right.
So what I have tried to do in my book is I chose two vehicles. One is the one that we touched upon, the kind of visual writing that I take you there and I use the story because, history is actually his story. It's a story. It's his story,
Right.
her story, or their story. Right? So uh, I did that to kind of get the reader engaged. And the other thing that I did, and it was a deliberate choice, I chose to focus not so much on the grand events and the politics and the intrigues, although they're in the backdrop, but I focused on how does all of that affect an ordinary person. And it's these two people who are dealing with events way beyond their control.
Right.
And how do their lives evolve on different tracks and perhaps meet. But I'll give you an example. I'll tell you a little story which kind of brought this notion of people being interested in the independence movement to life.
Uh-huh.
So there is a part of the in the book, and I
Uh-huh.
won't go too much into why, where Kumar gets a set of letters smuggled through a house
Uh-huh.
in Chennai, in an area called Vepuri. And I had the address of this house. It's on a street called Muthamudali Street. So my cousin and I showed up on Muthamudali Street one morning in an area called Vepuri.
Uh-huh.
On the first door, and I can speak Tamil, so I spoke to the lady, and there was a young lady there. She must have been maybe in her late 20s, 30s. She had a sari kind of tucked into her waist, and she had a spoon in her hand, and she had turmeric on her face, which they use for complexion.
Uh-huh.
So she was talking to two total strangers, okay? So I spoke to her about why I was there. I didn't know how to say grand uncle in Tamil, so I said grandfather anyway. So I said, this is why we're there to find out this is what happened to you. So she kind of looked at us strangely, and I thought she's going to say,
Yeah.
but she said, oh, really? I have to help you. And she spent, Deepika, I kid you not, 3 hours with us,
Wow.
house to house to house. And the people in those homes welcomed two perfect strangers into their homes, gave us coffee, sent the little boy running down, say, hey, go talk to that house, talk to those people.
Yeah.
We couldn't find the house because the numbering systems had changed and many things.
Right. Mhm.
But that reflected to me that people haven't forgotten. You know, they may be 30 years old, but it's,
Uh-huh.
and the fact that two strangers came and said this is why they were there, she took so many hours out of her day to
Yeah.
help us.
Yeah. What a beautiful anecdote that you relayed. And it so beautifully explains why it is and should be contextual to today's generation. That's beautiful. Thank you for sharing that with us. We are close to the end of time today, but I do want to ask a couple of quick questions. Hopefully, they'll be super quick and short. Is there a next project that you are working on or that's probably marinating in your head right now?
Well, I tell you, it's interesting, just the research that I did for this book through
Uh-huh.
so many such similar stories
Uh-huh.
of little known history.
Uh-huh.
So I think I'm going to stay in that genre of
Ah.
taking little known history, probably the history of the subcontinent, which is where
Uh-huh.
I have a fair degree of knowledge,
Uh-huh.
and do the same kind of thing. Use uh, fiction as a narrative vehicle to
Uh-huh.
make that little known history accessible.
Uh-huh.
There is of all kinds, not just scholars, but anybody that likes a good book.
Yeah. Oh,
Big
that's.
project in mind. It's still rattling around many stories in my head. And
Uh-huh.
so maybe
Oh,
later this year or early next year, I'll start germinating on my next book.
yeah. Yeah. Oh, great. I can't wait to see the next one come out. And hopefully, you'll come back to our studio and tell us more about that once it's ready.
Absolutely, I'd love to do that. Yeah.
Great. Great. Awesome. All right. So, final question before I let you go. Please tell our viewers where they can find a copy of the Swaraj Spy and how can they get their hands on it.
Okay, thank you for that question. The book is published by HarperCollins India. So if you're in India, it's available on Amazon India, and it's in all of the bookstores, the Crosswords and the Bari Sons in Delhi, and so on. But if you're outside India, if you're in the US, there are distributors who source the book in India and make it available on e-commerce platforms. The best place to go would be to go to a website, the Swaraj Spy, all one word, .com, theswarajspy.com. And that site has got buy links depending on where you are in the world. If you're in the US, even if you're in the UK, if you're in Australia, there are links that tell you where you can get the book. And the same website has also got reviews of the book. I've been fortunate enough to get some kind reviews and events that I've participated in and so on. So if you're in India, Amazon or any of the bookstores, if you're elsewhere on the globe, go to theswarajspy.com and it'll help you out.
Perfect. And if anyone's catching this a little bit later, reach out to us at Bharat Media, and we will hook you up with a copy of the book. We'll lead you to where you can find it. So not an issue for anybody who's outside of India and looking for the book, The Swaraj Spy. Like I said at the beginning of the show, I would highly recommend everybody, Indian or anybody who is interested in India, not necessarily historical, but modern. Any which way you look at it, it is a fantastic read. It is a very, very enjoyable, pacey book, which will never stay on your nightstand. You will pick it up every night, and every chapter will lead to the next chapter. Vijay, Balan, thank you so much for joining us today. I really appreciate you spending some time with us and talking to us about your book.
Thank you so much, Dee, for the opportunity to talk to you, and also through you to your viewers and listeners, and to folks who are watching this. Thank you for giving me your time, and I do hope you enjoy this book and my work. So thank you so much.
Great. Namaskar.